this painting is "The Desert is Full of Promises." And I've painted this on site over the course of 3 or 4 days whilst travelling through the desert. I spent a few days previously teaching in one of the refugee schools in Jordan, and subsequent to that took a few days to travel with ornithologists and ecologists and environmentalists who are surveying the desert, and particularly the changes in bird populations, to see how the desert changed and how the extraction of water from the oasis had changed the habitat there and consequently the populations of birds. In the painting you'll see I'd started off sketching this is a Temminck's horned lark, which is a desert specialist. It lives right out in the arid desert where there's virtually no vegetation. And the numbers of these birds had been increasing quite steadily as the desert had become drier and drier. At the end of one morning we stopped at the edge of a little oasis village, and the oasis had turned dry, so there was just a couple of dead palm trees there, and of course no water anymore. And it was a Bedouin village, and the people living there were camel herders. And as we stopped to brew up some tea and get something to eat, I did some sketches on top and around the drawing of the lark of this abandoned bus at the side of the village. And just at that time, there were some kids there who looked like they were going off to school, and they were standing beside the bus, waiting for the proper bus to take them to school. And a bee-eater just landed in the desert quite close to them, and they wandered over to have a look at it. And as we watched, we could see them all huddled round this bird, which was sort of fluffed up and on the ground in front of them. One of the Arabic bird watchers that I was travelling with went over and chatted to the kids, and he said, well, the bird's probably just dehydrated and exhausted. And the kids ran off and got some cardboard boxes and made a shelter for it and got a saucer of water. And the bird managed to recuperate in the shade and had a drink. And after about 15 minutes, it flew off across the desert. And over the next couple of days, I worked on this study that had been started out in the desert and completed it as you see it now. And in many ways, it kind of encapsulates that interaction between environment and people and birds that I'm trying to work with in the project. That interplay between environmental change, where the burden of increased population in Jordan has meant that the oases have run dry, and that's had a direct impact on migratory birds, which can no longer hop from oasis to oasis across the desert. They have to fly greater distances, and they're more prone, like the bee-eater in this painting, to become dehydrated and exhausted and crash land in the desert. But also it includes the horned lark, which is a desert specialist and has equally been influenced by the increasing desertification of the country, and is doing quite well. Its numbers are increasing. You can see it much more often. And there's an interplay as well with people, because the Bedouin kids are living in this increasingly arid landscape, and are interacting with this bird which has crash landed. The other thing I found, of all the places that I went to, many were distressing, and surprisingly Sicily was perhaps the most upsetting place to be because of the encounters that I was having with people who had just arrived in having crossed the Mediterranean in leaky boats from a war zone, and they were really destitute. Whereas in Jordan, there are a couple of things going on. People were often quite settled there, and had a lot of support. And I wonder if part of the reason for that was just the generosity of the Jordanian people, And that was something that I encountered again and again in speaking to Syrians and Iraqis who'd fled and ended up in Jordan. It was just how grateful they were for the shelter and help that they'd received from the Jordanian people. But also personally, I've never been in a country that's been more kind of welcoming and generous. The people were just incredible. We were thinking about it afterwards, and it seems quite likely that the bird, the bee-eater, which had been flying across the desert, had looked down and seen the blue roof of the bus and thought, that's water, and that's why it had landed there right beside the children. By chance, this painting kind of elegantly brought together all the main topics that I was dealing with in the project. The bird populations and migrations indicating a rapidly changing environment, and the interconnectedness of people with environment, and the impact on local communities, and the metaphor of shared responsibilities and the impetus to act and intervene with sympathy and humanity.